What about you?
What about me? My tastes are immaterial. If you must know, if I could listen to nothing else for the rest of my life, I would probably listen mostly to early 80s post-punk and death rock. So do with that information what you will. Okay, so the reason I'm putting the group presentations thing back up here to start with is because, one, given last week's weather, a lot of you weren't here, so maybe some of you didn't see your group assignment. The other reason is because those of you who are in group 1, given other life events, I have had to move the date of your presentation. Right, so, okay, as most of you know, right, we weren't supposed to be here this week. So I'm sorry about that. I wasn't expecting to be here in front of you either. But the surgeon's office, the guy who's supposed to do the procedure on my wife, called Monday morning at 9:30 and told us that he had the flu. So they had to cancel. And we had to reconstruct a whole week that we thought we had lost. So yay, that was fun. So I will actually be out now the week that our first presentation group was originally supposed to go, right? So I've restructured the syllabus slightly. We're going to be doing Ovid now on the 19th of February, which gives those of you who are in the first presentation group an extra 5 days to put something together, right? So that's, Seth, Bradley, Addie, and Taylor. You guys are the first presentation group. Do you all know who the others are? Okay, Seth, Addie, Taylor, Bradley. So get together at the end of class and exchange information. Is there anybody else who does not know which presentation group they're in or who their presentation group partners are? Okay, so we may as well just go back over it quickly, because that's kind of a lot of you. Excuse me. Okay, second group on the 26th, where pretty much every name that starts with a K in class ended up for whatever weird reason. Okay, this is Corbin Etheridge, Kathy Tran, Kanisha Tooks, Carmen Smith, and DeMarcus Johnson. Right, you guys are working in the Tao Te Ching. Working on the way the Pillars of Islam are represented in the 1001 Nights is Lola, Jared, Sheldon, Jakayla, who is not here, right, and Brett. Working on Rasa theory in the plays of the Indian playwright Kalidasa, Alicia, Deandra, Tashana, Caitlin Bailey, and Sarah Sellers. Working on oral tradition and the griot or Jeli in the Epic of Sanjata, Vivica Streetman, Tatiana Owens, Aaliyah Gardner, Chris Bivens, who is not here, and Victor Bush. This is also actually giving me a little bit more practice in remembering who's who. So that's good, that's great. And working on human sacrifice, we have Kristen Stokes, Keyshandra Shipp, Shantia Reynolds, and Wallace Harper. Okay, so now everybody knows who's in your group, right? If you have not yet exchanged information with your other group members, do so at the earliest opportunity, right? I think I've already given the Ovid group a couple of sources they should check out. Remember that I have been posting that I have bibliographies posted as well for each text in Georgia View. You can use those as a starting point. Those of you who are working on the Tao Te Ching, I'll send you guys some stuff shortly as well, okay? All right, any questions about this? All right, wonderful. And let me just briefly show you a little bit of the extra content I've got here for today's text. So in addition to my bibliography, there's a video lecture by Christine Hayes, who teaches, I believe, at Harvard, on Genesis in the context of other Near Eastern ancient mythological narratives, right? So, comparing it to, say, Babylonian myth, Sumerian myth, Greek myth, things of that nature, okay? We also have an explanation by Martin Zelkowitz at the University of Maryland of the documentary hypothesis. We'll talk about what the documentary hypothesis is today. Essentially, it has to do with the way the first 5 books of the Bible are written. And there's also a little article here on the Etemenanke. The Etemenanke was a temple of Marduk in Babylon that some archaeologists may think may have provided a real-world source for the Tower of Babel story. So that's that. All right, so before we get talking today about this, material from Genesis, right? I want to make sure everybody understands what we're doing here today, right? Like, I get that this is sensitive stuff that is really meaningful for a lot of people, right? And my purpose here today is not to attack or undermine anyone's deeply held beliefs. I just want to make that clear right off the bat, right? However, we are going to be looking at this text not as a religious text, but as a literary mythological text, right? So we are going to be looking at it in the context, again, of other texts of the same era from the same region. We're going to be talking a little bit about problems of authorship, and we are going to be talking, we're not going to be looking at this from any particular religious perspective, right? One thing to note, right, is that we are going to be trying to look at it from the perspective of the culture that produced it, right? Which means that to, say, the Israelites who first put this together, remember that the symbolism for them doesn't necessarily add up to what it does for a Christian, right? To the ancient Israelites, for example, the snake in the garden is just a snake, right? It's not the devil. There is no devil in the Israelite religion or Judaism. That's a concept that doesn't really exist. So, with that in mind, sort of let's proceed here a little bit. I just need to get this back from you. Thanks. All right, so, to whom is authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible usually attributed? Yeah, the traditional explanation is that the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were all written by Moses, right? Now, this is actually a fairly late tradition. People didn't start regarding Moses as the author of these particular books until after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, right? So this would be sort of within the era of like what we call late antiquity, right? Now, it really kind of this belief spreads from Jewish rabbis out into Christian tradition in the Middle Ages. And it was rarely challenged until about the 19th century when several scholars, mostly working in Germany, discovered a few kind of inconsistencies. Things that suggest that Moses could not possibly have actually written this. The first, Moses is always referred to in the third person, right? Okay, in and of itself, not that big a deal, right? In and of itself, not a huge issue, But he also describes himself in kind of unlikely ways. For example, at one point in the narrative, Moses is described as the humblest man on earth. Now, if you describe yourself as the humblest man on earth, have you not already negated that statement? Third, we have at the end of the book of Numbers a report of Moses' death. Right? He's sitting atop Mount Nebo watching the Israelites stream into the Promised Land, but he's not permitted to go in, right? It is highly unlikely that he would have written an account of his own death. Frequent use of the expression "to this day" indicates a retrospective perspective, right? That people are looking back on something that happened or that they believe to have happened in the past. There are a lot of anachronistic place names, right? Places are given names that they wouldn't have had at the time that Moses lived, right? That names they were given later. There is also inclusion of material from after Moses' own lifetime. For example, there's a list of kings at one point of the nation of Edom who wouldn't have, who weren't born until centuries after Moses died. And finally, and this is probably the most telling indication, not just of that Moses couldn't have been the author, but that one person couldn't have been the author. There's the presence of what are called doublets. These are contradictory accounts of the same event. So to give you an example of this, if we look at the flood story, right, if we turn in our textbook to page 163, right, near the end of chapter 6 here, right, God gives Noah, the direct instructions, okay, this is, what I want you to do. This is the size of the ark I want you to build, right? And then he tells him about how many animals he wants him to take into the ark, right? And from all that lives, from all flesh, 2 of each thing you shall bring to the ark to keep alive with you. Male and female they shall be. From the fowl of each kind, and from the cattle of each kind, and from all that crawls on the earth of each kind, 2 of each thing shall come to you to be kept alive. As for you, take you from every food that is eaten, and store it by you, to serve for you and for them as food. And this Noah did, as God commanded him, so he did. All right, so is any distinction here really made between different kinds of animals in terms of the instruction that Noah is given? No. 2 of everything, right? Bring a pair of all animals. Now, if we look then to chapter 7, and the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, for it is you I have seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean animal take you 7 pairs, each with its mate, and of every animal that is not clean, 1 pair, each with its mate. Of the fowl of the heavens as well 7 pairs, male and female, to keep seed alive over all the earth. For in 7 days' time I will make it rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights," and so on and so forth. What's different here in the instruction?
It was specific.
Okay, yeah.
And like clean and not clean.
Yeah, there's a distinction here now being made between clean and unclean animals, right? That the earlier chapter does not make. Okay, well, what's the explanation for that? The most likely explanation, according to biblical scholars, and by this I mean academic biblical scholars, right? You know, people in universities with PhDs who study this sort of thing, is that what we have here are two different accounts written at different times and at different stages of cultural development that have been woven together, right? The first written by a people who did not make a distinction between clean and unclean animals. The second written by a people who do. Does everybody understand, by the way, what's meant here by clean and unclean animals? Okay, Seth, you're nodding. What does that mean? Clean and unclean.
I could be a little bit wrong. I'm pretty sure unclean refers to pigs, shrimp, lobster, crab.
Yes.
Scavengers, basically.
Yes.
Animals that eat crab, basically. For lack of a better word.
Bottom feeders of various sorts. Yeah. And yeah, from a Jewish religious perspective, right? Clean animals are the ones it's okay to eat. Unclean animals are the ones it's not okay to eat, right? So as you were saying, pigs, shellfish, that sort of thing, right? So yeah, that's what the distinction is here. Animals that are ritually clean are those that are actually acceptable for temple sacrifice, which meant also you could eat them. Yeah, Victor, what were you going to say?
The unclean animals, couldn't it represent, I don't know specifically who they were, but it was like a 1/3 that was cast down. I don't know, was it Alcadians, Anunnaki, something like that. But they basically mated with mortal women.
Yeah.
But they mated with animals as well.
Okay, I think
represent the unclean animal.
What clean and unclean here mean, literally what we're talking about is animals that were acceptable for sacrifice in the temple and animals that were not acceptable for sacrifice in the temple. That's what the clean-unclean distinction is about. I think what you're talking about here, they mentioned briefly the Nephilim.
They're like giants or something like that.
Yeah, and this in chapter 6, near the beginning of it, right? The Nephilim were then upon the earth, and afterwards as well, the sons of God, having come to bed with the daughters of man, who bore them children, they are the heroes of yore, the men of renown, right? So what the Nephilim are, basically, now their creation is being attributed to angels, right? Not to gods, but they're essentially the same thing as demigods in other ancient Mediterranean cultures, right? So, the equivalent of Achilles or Gilgamesh, right, or other people who are part human and part god. So what that shows is that there is a similar tradition in the distant past of the Israelites, probably buried in the official text here, in which there were semi-divine heroes running around doing the kinds of things Gilgamesh did. Look, if we want to talk about similarities between cultures here, right? One thing to note is that the people who became the Israelites started out as nomadic herds people in southern Iraq, right? In the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, around the same place where the Gilgamesh myth began, right? So we're talking about cultures that, one culture started building cities pretty early. The other remained nomadic for a long time. But they're probably related. Their languages were related. Indeed, it's not surprising to find a number of shared beliefs between the two, or shared traditions. Other thing to note in the Noah and the flood story, and the reason I point to this, right, is just because it's one of the most obvious examples of a doublet, right? The length of the flood is not consistent either, right? It's 40 days, then it's 150 days, then it's 40 days, then it's 150 days, right? So again, what we're seeing there is two different accounts written at different times, woven together. The 40 days probably comes from the later account because 40 is a ritually significant number. So what happened here? Well, in 1878, a German scholar by the name of Julius Wellhausen published what has come to be called the documentary hypothesis. So called because he sort of tries to break down which separate documents make up the narrative of the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So Wellhausen, or he's German, so I guess Wellhausen, right? Isolates what he believes to be 4 different authors, who he calls the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly author, and the Deuteronomist. They're usually identified just by the first letter in scholarship. So one of the ways we isolate each of these authors, right, is the name that they use for God, right? The name that is used for God is not consistent across the Hebrew version either, right? So the Yahwist tends to use the 4-letter combination YHWH, which used to be translated into English as Jehovah, now is believed to actually be correctly pronounced Yahweh. The Elohist uses the word El, which is a Western Semitic word that simply means small g, God, right? Any God was referred to as El, or Elohim, right? Elohim means the children of El. The priestly author uses the word Adonai. Adonai, in Hebrew, means Lord. So it's no longer a proper name that's being used, or even sort of directly referring to God as a God, right? It's using a euphemism to refer to him, which suggests a cultural taboo against saying the name of God that develops at some point. And the Deuteronomist is actually only responsible for writing one of the first 5 books of the Bible, right? The Deuteronomist is just whoever wrote the book of Deuteronomy, which is substantially different from the other 4. The Deuteronomist is also believed by scholars to have written, I think, the book of the books of Chronicles. It's either Chronicles or Kings. I can't remember off the top of my head which. But anywho, so what each of these indicates for Wellhausen and for scholars who followed him are different stages in the development of the Israelite religion that becomes Judaism. Right? When we talk about the religion of the ancient Israelites, we're not talking about Judaism, we're not talking about modern Judaism. We're talking about the precursor religion of the modern Abrahamic faiths, right? So we're talking about the precursor religion for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? So the Yahwist has been dated by scholars to anywhere from the 10th century BCE to the 7th century BCE. So the Elohist has been dated to the 8th century BCE. So these two are the earliest strands, right? There's disagreement as to which is actually older, but these are the oldest. The priestly author probably wrote in the 6th or the 5th century BCE. So at least within the first 4 books, the priestly author is the newest, right? And the Deuteronomist probably wrote in the 6th century BCE. And you can also see like different stages in the development of the religion, in that God behaves differently in different strands, or deals with humans differently in each of these strands. Right? For example, in the Yahwist strand, God is much more anthropomorphic, right? It's a much more human-like God who actually does things like take walks in a garden, who actually speaks with human beings directly. In the Elohist strand, meanwhile, God usually communicates with human beings either through angelic messengers or through dreams. So, for example, how many of you are familiar with the Joseph narrative from Genesis? Okay, that's a couple of you, right? And what's Joseph's great gift? What's his talent?
Interpreting dreams?
Yeah, he's an interpreter of dreams, right? So most of the Joseph story comes from the Elohist, yeah. Yeah, right, the Technicolor Dreamcoat and all that, yeah. My wife makes me listen to that in the car a lot. So, yeah. Meanwhile, in the priestly strand, right, you have a much more kind of distant, remote God who is mostly a voice that proclaims things and makes rules. So, the Yahwist and the Elohist are regarded as belonging to the phase of the earliest phase of the Israelite religion, when it was still primarily a nature and fertility religion, not too what the hell was that? Not too dissimilar from other similar faiths in the region. By the time the Deuteronomist writes, and the Deuteronomist gives us one of the versions of the Ten Commandments, right? There are 2 different versions of the Ten Commandments in the first 5 books, right? There's one in Exodus, and there's one in Deuteronomy, and the rules they present are slightly different. The Deuteronomist is giving us a religion that has now developed a spiritual and ethical dimension, while the priestly author is giving us a fully formed, organized religion with temples and rules and ritual prescriptions. Things you can do, things you can't do, right? So yeah, we have your 3 different phases of development. Now, it would probably be instructive for us. So we looked a little bit at the Noah story here, and sort of the basic differences there, right? Just because it's fairly easy to spot those discrepancies in numbers between the 2 different accounts woven together, right? The accounts in the Noah story are believed to be the Yahwist doing the 2x2 thing, right? And the 7 unclean one, the 7 clean, 1 unclean is probably from the priestly strand. If we look at the first 2 chapters here, when we're looking at sort of the story of creation, right now, it's not always immediately obvious that what we're looking at are two different stories, because we're used to thinking of chapter 2 as a kind of continuation of what happens in chapter 1, right? But let's look a little bit more closely at these two stories and see what we can pull out here. Can I get a volunteer to start reading on page 158, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, when God began to create.
I'll read.
Okay, go for it, yeah.
When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide water from water." And God made the vault, and it divided the water beneath the vault from the water above the vault, and so it was. And God called the vault heavens, and it was evening, and it was morning, second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, so that the dry land will appear," and so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth grow grass, plants yielding seed of each kind of trees, bearing fruit of each kind that has its seed within it upon the earth," and so it was. And the earth put forth grass, plants yielding seed, and trees bearing fruit of each kind. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, we can stop there for now, right? So if we look at the first sentence here, are we looking at a creation from nothing? Is there nothing that exists before the work of creation starts? When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth was then welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, are we looking at just empty space here?
No, it's saying like something was there. Like,
Yeah, something was there, right? Now, welter and waste, what kind of thing is that?
Really hot and barren.
Yeah, it's basically chaos, right? It's this, sort of chaotic jumble. And there's water, right? There is water. God's breath hovers over the waters, right? So there's chaos and there's water. Now this does not actually look too dissimilar at this point from certain other creation myths we've looked at, right? So if we recall, for example, when we talked about the Enuma Elish, right? The Babylonian creation myth, Marduk kills a chaos monster who happens to also be a personification of salt water, right? So the first thing that exists is water, right? Everything is created from the mingling of the sweet waters and the salt waters, right? And Marduk makes the world by killing that dragon, by killing that water dragon, and basically chopping up her body, right? Dividing it and making different parts of the universe out of her corpse, right? Now, we don't have here the corpse of a dead dragon, right? But we do have the work of creation primarily being done through acts of division, right? I divide this thing from this thing, right? I divide the light from the dark. I divide the earth from the heavens, right? I divide the waters from the land. Yeah, Carmen.
Was the Hebrew Bible the first written version of the Bible?
Yeah, we're looking here at the earliest. We're looking here like the scriptures of the ancient Israelites, then kind of woven together into a single narrative, right? So yeah, I mean it's certainly the first version of what we would call the Bible. Yeah. However, as I was saying earlier, like most scholars believe that it's made up of pre-existing texts that the only parts of which we still have are those that are now contained in the Bible. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So right, he's dividing things and he's naming things. Right now, remember too that Greek creation myth we talked about in theogony, right, was largely about divisions between things, right? The first thing that exists is chaos. And, the heavens have to be split from the earth, right, in order for the act of creation to continue. So what we're seeing now is not unusual in context, right, for ancient Mediterranean creation myths. Now, where do human beings come in this account? Do human beings come into the chapter 1 of Genesis creation early or late?
A little later.
Yeah, they're the last thing that is actually created, right?
I think it was on the 6th day.
Yeah, and then on the 7th day, rest, right?
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, human beings are created last in the chapter 1 account. And they're both created at the same time, right? And little distinction is made between them. In fact, one thing also to note about chapter 1 of Genesis is that human beings are never the subject of a sentence in chapter 1. They're always the object of a sentence. They're always acted upon rather than actually acting. So we have here in chapter 1 a more distant, remote God speaking things into existence, right? Now, if we look at chapter 2, can I get a volunteer to start reading from the beginning of chapter 2?
I'll read.
Yeah, Vivica, go for it.
Then the heavens and the earth were completed in all their array, and God completed on the seventh day the task he had done, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the tasks he had done, and God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, for on it he had ceased from all his tasks that he had created to do. This is the tale of the heavens and the earth when they were created. On the day the Lord God made earth and heavens, no shrub of the field being yet on the earth, and no plant of the field yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not caused rain to fall on the earth, and there was no human to till the soil, and wetness would well from the earth to water all the surface of the soil. Then the Lord God fashioned the humus from the soil, and blew into his nostrils for breath of life, and the human became a living creature. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden to the east, and he placed there the human he had fashioned. And the Lord God caused to sprout from the soil every tree lovely to look at and good for food. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge good and evil.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there. So, do we have here an account of creation that simply continues or complements what we had in chapter 1? What's different here?
It's like he's not really. It talks about him creating a human, but it's not really talking about on this day he made this and on this day he made this. Like it's
Okay.
just saying basically what he did after all of that.
The separation into days is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is he actually doing things in the same order that he did in chapter 1? What's the first thing well, in chapter 1, right? He causes the plants to sprout from the earth by speaking it.
But now it's like he can't make them sprout until there's rain.
Yeah.
Until there's someone to tend the soil.
Exactly. There's got to be rain, there's got to be someone to till the soil, and he creates human beings first, right? So human beings come last in chapter 1. They come first in chapter 2. And if we look as well at the way God behaves in chapter 2, right? He's not speaking human beings into existence, right? He's directly shaping earth into a human form, right? So we have in the second account a much more human-like God doing human-like things. And human beings are much more central to the whole vision of the narrative, right? Instead of simply being the end product of this whole process, right? Human beings are vital to the entire project from the beginning, right? There needs to be a human to till the soil. There needs to be a human to tend the garden before there can be gardens. And yeah, as you were saying as well, that garden needs rain in order to grow it all, right? You can't just speak it up. So this is reflecting that earlier stratum of nature and fertility religion that underlies the more ritualized religion of the first chapter, right? We have that more anthropomorphic God dealing directly with humans, directly, like literally getting his hands dirty, making a person, right? Then he makes a second person, or he recognizes that the man is lonely, and so pulls out his rib and makes another person out of that, right? Rather than speaking both people into existence at the same time. So there's even distance between the creation of man and the creation of woman, right? Now again, the reason I point this out is to show that we have separate narratives woven together here. That we have separate narratives sort of put together into the same place. Now that said, there are certain consistencies of style that we find throughout the entire text. And there are certain concerns that I think remain, I think that most of the strands here share as well. Do we get a lot of narration here, like explaining to us directly things that happened, or do we mostly learn about things through dialogue? Most of what we tend to get, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, is people talking to each other, right? You don't often have an outside narrator coming in and telling you what people are thinking, right? In fact, is it ever all that easy to tell what people are actually thinking or what their motivations are? I'll give it to you as an example, the Cain and Abel story. Right? If we look on page 161, towards the bottom of the page, can I get a volunteer to read from the beginning of chapter 4? Okay, go for it, Eddie.
And the human knew Eve, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have got me a man with the Lord. And she bore as well his brother Abel. And Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you incensed, and why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well, or whether you don't, at the 10th flap sin clashes, and for you is its longing, but you will roll over it.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there. Okay, so are we ever told directly here in the narrative why Cain's sacrifice is rejected? Are we given any their tradition gives us certain reasons, right? But does the text itself explain why Cain's sacrifice is rejected? Take a minute, think about it. Does it actually tell us anything about Cain prior to that point, except that he's a farmer and that he's Adam and Eve's firstborn? There's nothing there to tell us why his sacrifice wasn't acceptable, right? For whatever reason, it just isn't. Now, I believe there is a reason that is not clearly expressed but is implied, but we'll get to that in a moment, right? The thing that I want to point to right now is that psychology and questions of motivation are largely absent from biblical narrative. how many of you are familiar with the story of Abraham and Isaac going up onto the mountain, where Abraham is supposed to sacrifice his favorite son, right? Not his only son, but his favorite son. And it never tells us throughout that whole narrative what Abraham is actually thinking about any of this. It never tells us whether Isaac has any idea what's going on, right? It just describes the action mostly through dialogue, right? This is one of the most important features of biblical narrative generally, is that it lacks any real discussion of psychology or motivation, right? Things just happen. And we're not really told why. It's not regarded as important. So, Cain kills his brother, right? It's important to note here as well what their separate professions are, right? What does Cain do for a living?
He tills the soil.
Yeah, he's a farmer. And what does Abel do for a living?
He herds the sheep.
He herds the sheep. A farmer and a shepherd. Which of these is actually harder work?
A shepherd.
Why would you say a shepherd?
Because you have to actually walk with the sheep and watch where they go, and sheep are actually really stupid.
Sheep are really stupid, right?
They can drown in 3 inches of water.
They can. But I mean, if you've got a decent dog and are reasonably watchful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a particularly physically taxing job?
No, not really.
You can pretty much just sit there and your dog will do most of the work, right? Now, what about farming?
Yeah.
You kind of have to do everything.
Yeah.
You have to cut the grass, grass, work on, that's tend the gardens, feed the animals, raise the animals, kill the animals.
Yep, you're up at the ass crack of dawn, right? Now, none of us like that. But yeah, I think the point is that Cain isn't a stock farmer. He's, a tiller of the soil, so he grows vegetables. But what's the necessary ingredients for civilization, city building, right? What do you have to develop as a people before you can start building cities? Agriculture is the first step, right? You can't build a city until you have a stable food source. And you can't have a stable food source until you can grow your own food. Now, if we look at page 161, when God curses Adam and Eve for their disobedience, what's the curse he places on them? The second poem, or the third poem that we see on page 161. Can I get somebody to read that for us? Cursed be the soil.
Cursed be the soil for your sake. With pangs shall you eat from it all the days of your life. Thorn and thistle shall it sprout for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, till you return to the soil. For from there you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust shall you return.
So what kind of attitude towards agriculture does this suggest? Pardon?
Barren lands.
Yeah, barren, hard work.
Grow anything.
Yeah, hard work that you have to scrape out of barren lands, right? So, is farming viewed positively here? Farming is the result of a curse, right? Agriculture is something people are cursed with. Curse. Now, which profession, you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute, which profession requires more technological sophistication, even at very low levels? Farming or sheep herding?
Farming.
Definitely farming, right? Now, if we look at Cain the farmer's descendants on page 162, can I get somebody to read from, and Cain went out from the Lord's presence? Yeah, Kathy, go for it.
And Cain went out from the Lord's presence and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she had conceived and bore Enoch. Then he became the builder of the city and called the names of the city like his son's name, Enoch. And Aaron was born to Enoch, and Aaron begot Mehujael.
Close enough.
And Mehujael begot Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech. And Lamech took him 2 wives, and the name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. and Ada bore Jabal. He was the first of the tent dwellers with livestock, and his brother's name was Jubal. He was the first of all who played on the lyre and pipe. As Rizillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged every tool of copper and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there. So, what does Cain go off and do once he's cast out of Eden?
He's fruitful and multiply.
He's fruitful. Like I've always kind of wondered where Mrs. Cain came from. It's yeah. What? Okay. Once he starts becoming fruitful and multiplying, then what does he do? He builds a city, right?
Oh,
Yeah, he builds a city. And then what sorts of things do his descendants do? Right. Pardon?
Like hard labor work, forging.
Yeah, they do various kinds of work, right? But they invent things, right? They start things, they innovate. You know, the first guy to make tools out of copper and iron, right? The first guy to compose music on the lyre and the pipe, right? This actually seems like a pretty illustrious and accomplished line here, yeah?
Yeah.
And yet, this is also the sinful line, right? The line that invites God's wrath in the flood. Whereas Abel, who was just, Abel leaves behind no descendants, right?
Right,
Yeah, but we're not really told anything about the accomplishments of the third brother, Seth's children, right? He just, apart from producing Noah, eventually, right? Seth's line doesn't seem to accomplish as much. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is sort of like about what Cain's line accomplishes, and the text's attitude towards that. We can see something similar. I promise I will connect all these dots eventually, right? If you start connecting them yourself as I'm talking, then please feel free to say something. We look on page 167, right? The story of the Tower of Babel, right? And all the earth was one language, one set of words. And it happened as they journeyed from the east that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let us bake bricks and burn them hard." And the bricks served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, that we may make us a name, lest we be scattered over all the earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the human creatures had built. And the Lord said, "As one people with one language for all, if this is what they have begun to do, now nothing they plot to do will elude them. Come, let us go down and baffle their language there, so that they will not understand each other's language." And the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it is called Babel, for there the Lord made the language of all the earth Babel. And from there the Lord scattered them over all the earth. So what sin, if we just look at the literal language of this passage, do these people commit?
He wanted to be as God.
Well, what suggests they want to be as God?
I didn't want
What are they literally trying to do?
trying to go to heaven, making a city until they reach heaven.
Yeah. Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, that we may make us a name. Right now, the heavens just refers to the sky, right? So what they're trying to do is build a city with a tall tower, right? What is it that makes this action fearful or threatening? Yeah, Bradley.
They're kind of like putting themselves parallel to being creators themselves.
Yeah, all of these, this is a way we can sort of connect this to Cain's line generally, right? Is you have a line here of creators and makers. Talented creators and makers.
And in a way, it's mimicking what God can do,
Mhm.
but almost with
But God does these things by himself, right?
Right.
What's the fear about human beings here? Why does he have to confound their language?
That they collaborate.
Yeah, there's lots of them, right? They can collaborate on projects together, right? If they're permitted to all gather in one place, right? If they are permitted to build a civilization, they can become threatening, right? They can do things that God doesn't want them doing. So there seems to be sort of throughout the narrative a kind of jaundiced attitude, a sort of dislike for city building and civilization-making activity, right? I think, most of the attitude towards technology here, towards any profession that involves technology, and towards the building of cities, is that this is a negative thing, right? That's done by evil people thinking beyond their station. Now, if we think about this in terms of the origins of the Israelite people as well, right? What did we say at the beginning of class about where they came from?
Southern Iraq.
Southern Iraq, right? Yeah. Southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia, right? Between the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. And how were they different from most of their neighbors there?
They were nomadic.
They were nomadic herdsmen, yes. Remained so after most of their neighbors started building cities. Right? So city building was something that the neighbors they didn't like were involved in, right? So we've seen a couple of ways in which the origins of these people influence the content of their religious narrative, right? That there are some similarities, for example, between the Genesis creation story and the Babylonian creation story, particularly in terms of the role of water and water creatures. But we can also see here how they are identifying themselves as different from their neighbors, right? These are the people who build cities, right? These are the people who make temples to Marduk that stretch up into the sky. We don't do that sort of thing. That sort of thing is wicked, and we avoid it. Right? They're not the only peoples, by the way, who have the same kind of narrative. The Greeks have a narrative as well. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the Odyssey, because it's actually kind of relevant to, in particular, the Cyclops episode in the Odyssey, right? Of a sort of degeneration from a golden age in which people just get whatever they need from the land without having to work it, right? Apples just fall off trees. Animals apparently just jump right onto your plate and say, eat up. Fish are plentiful in the streams, right? People live easily without having to work, without needing technology, right? The Silver Age, things get a little bit harder. Maybe you got to build a ladder now to reach those apples, right? You still don't have to work very hard. Life is still pretty good and still pretty easy. But you have to put a little bit more effort into earning your bread, right? Maybe you have to start, say, planting seeds or herding sheep. The Bronze Age, right? People invent tools and weapons. So on the one hand, you can build neat stuff, but your neighbors become more jealous of the stuff you have, and they want to make weapons and tools out of bronze to fight you and kill you for it. And the Iron Age is both the most technologically advanced and the most hostile to human life. Right? So there is, around the ancient Mediterranean, this narrative of degeneration that comes along with technological advancement. Right? That the things that we build, the things that we make, eventually come to rule our lives and to make us worse, right? To sort of kill our human impulses. Now, for someone who is, mildly to moderately technophobic like myself, this particular narrative is actually kind of appealing, right? You know, smash the machine, smash the computers. But, yeah, what we get here, I think, in the book of Genesis is a version of this same narrative, right? The technological advancement is at best suspect, as it leads people to rebel against what is viewed as God's will, right? Okay, so I know I've kind of hit you with a lot of stuff. Does anybody have any questions about any of this material or about the reading? Yeah, okay, DeMarcus, go for it.
I was wondering, like, why does he keep trying to delay advances in human society? Like, God himself, it seemed like
Yeah.
he wanted to keep us, like,
Dependent.
Yeah, well, and yeah, what is the tree that human beings are not permitted to eat from?
Good and evil.
The tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? Right. If you don't know the difference between good and evil, it doesn't matter to you, right? Yeah. But the eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? They understand the distinction now. Yeah, the expansion of human knowledge, you're right. There seems to be a sort of hostility to that here. And I think that some of that has to do with differentiation between the Israelites and their neighbors who more aggressively pursued technological advancement and also tended to more aggressively pursue things like imperial projects, right? You know, going out and conquering defenseless villages of nomadic herdsmen. But there is also, there is a kind of narrative, you're right, of dependence there as well. That the God of, particularly the J and E strands, right? Because as we said before, God is characterized slightly differently in each of these strands. But particularly in the J and E strands, where he still deals directly with human beings, yeah, there is that sort of relationship of dependence created, right? He's always makes covenants with people. He directly steps in and makes human beings, issues them commands, and directly stops them when they do things he doesn't like. I'm talking so much here because I'm not really quite sure. I mean, this is a question that I actually think about a lot myself. And I'm not really quite sure how to answer it, but I think it is actually a fruitful area of discussion and exploration. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer. But thank you for raising the point. Any other questions, guys? Anything that is particularly troubling you or confusing you? All right, I will take your general silence to mean no. Okay, so a couple of reminders, right? Remember that you only have until this Friday night, right, to get response paper 1 done. So if you have not yet done the first response paper, remember that it must be done by Friday. Also, the reading quiz on the second half of Gilgamesh, right, is posted online. Make sure that you take it. Make sure that you do that. Yes?
The other day, I think I might have saw a notification for the reading quiz 1 and 2. Are there 2 or?
No, there were going to be 2 because I wasn't supposed to be here today.
Okay.
And yeah, the 2 was supposed to hold you accountable for the material. But
Gotcha.
since I'm here anyway.
So I just went to do 1 and I thought there was 2 at one point. But
Yeah, there were 2. But yeah, you only have, I deleted the
so I'm
second.
not crazy.
You're not crazy. No. You are not hallucinating. Okay, so I have some reading questions for the portion of the Odyssey I'm asking you to read for next time. Right, you're going to be reading books 6 through 8. And once you've got whatever you want from this, you are free to go.
So is response paper 1 over basically anything we've read up to
Yes.
now?
Anything we've read up to now. And response paper 2 can be about anything we've read between weeks 2 and 4, right? Can't be on the same thing you wrote about for response paper 1.
We just took a picture of it, we're good, right?
Yeah.
It can't be from the same text, or is there something different?
If it's from the same text, it has to be from different things.
Right, yeah.
So if you wanted to do both on